Hey everybody, how are we doing today? Good weekends? Did you get to play in the snow? Hopefully no injuries. Oops. Good. We didn't have any snow related injuries. My daughter did something to her neck though on her gymnastics bar. That was fun. Um okay, as people still trickle in, does anybody have any announcements or anything they want to talk about at the beginning of class? Increasing Russian encroachment on Ukraine and Finland, and Sweden's desire to join NATO. It is an interesting topic. I'll be honest with you, I don't know a whole lot about it, other than it seems like Russia is somewhat poised to do something. TK, you know more about it?
Oh no, I was raising my hand to share, I guess, some piece of news. I heard that the Postal Service is now delivering a shipment of 4 COVID tests, and the link went live, and I can put it in the chat after class is over.
Okay, that'd be great. Abby?
I was just gonna say, related to the Russia thing, I know that we had information that Russia was gonna attack Ukraine on Ukrainian Independence Day, which is January 21st or 22nd. I can't remember. But we were sending a lot of troops, but they backed down, I believe, because I know we pulled all of our troops back out. They didn't end up deploying, so
Hmm.
that's a good sign at least. I hope.
You never know with with Putin. Jay?
Um, Question. Are we so for the for the policy like area, can we do foreign policy as our
Yeah.
like preferred area?
As your what area? Your preferred area?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Also to the Russia thing. So there was a big development last week where apparently like a Russian sub cut a bunch of underwater fiber optic cables from Norway to Longyearbyen, which is one of the islands they have in the north. And
Uh,
also, there's been like a bunch of Russian troops mobilizing in Karelia and in Belarus. And because of that, Sweden is sending troops to Gotland to reinforce the island. And there's like a bunch of tension because people are like, I think Germany is kind of on the fence on whether it would support Ukraine because everyone needs natural gas for the winter. And almost all of Europe buys its natural gas from Russia. So it's kind of like if you're going to support Ukraine, then you won't have like heating in the winter.
okay. Samuel?
I think the North Carolina legislature is going to delay the primaries again. So if you are a student who wants to go to the election, then make sure to get an absentee ballot because you won't be able to vote on campus.
All right, so he said your audio is a little bit off, but it looks like the North Carolina legislature is going to delay the primaries again. So if you're a student, you should get an absentee ballot. Yeah. Sneha?
Yeah, protests just happening all across the country in favor for John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and I think they're currently debating that. I think it was just like on the TV, so those deliberations have been happening for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, I gotta get around the filibuster there, right? Yeah. Ibrahim?
I was gonna say too. I was going to go back to the Russia topic. Jay brings up like a good point with the whole like the Sweden going to the island because it's a strategic point. But also there was also another development last week about U.S. intelligence gathered that Putin may be planning to bring expert Russian bombers in to attack Russian proxies within Ukraine, and so by doing so, he gives himself the right to essentially attack Ukraine because it's like it
Yeah.
constitutes war. So, but that was
It's one of those false flag operations.
right. Yeah. Yes. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really put a whole lot beyond that. But being honest, it's something I need to pay more attention to. And just haven't. The only somewhat international thing that I've been looking at was that undersea volcanic eruption. Anybody see that? Like, it's sort of near Tonga in the Pacific Ocean, but it is likely to be the most violent eruption in 30 years on Earth. It's an underwater eruption that sent steam and ash and stuff about 12 miles into the sky. That's just crazy to me. So, anyhow. Okay. A couple things, course related. We have not, as a department, gotten back together to figure out if we're going to be remote beyond this week. We'll definitely be remote this week. My own sort of preliminary analysis of the numbers, it looks like we haven't peaked yet. We're not even really close to peaking. So there's a good chance we'll be remote at least next week. But I will let y'all know for sure by Thursday's class. I mean, we're going to be remote on Thursday no matter what. But hopefully can get some guidance from other people and figure that out. Also, sort of related to that, make sure that you do the surveys that are posted on Sakai. I checked the policy analysis topics one earlier today, and there were still about a third of you that hadn't filled it out. Make sure you do that. It's not locking you into anything. You can change your topic. It's just getting you thinking about it. And today we're going to be talking about problem definitions. There are 3 surveys. That's correct. The reason I want you to sort of fill it out before today is that as I'm talking, you can sort of be brainstorming on your own problem, right? And making notes and all that kind of thing. So do fill that out as soon as you can so that we can get you assigned to a grader. Also, we got a while yet, but the first problem set is due on February 1st. The way that usually goes down is I post it about a week before it's due. So you'll have plenty of time to do it. If I can get it posted before then, I will. But normally it's about a week before I post that. And we try to get the grades turned around in about a week with the problem sets as well. I think that's everything I had in terms of course related stuff. Any questions? What types of problems? These aren't really this first one especially isn't really a problem set. It's gonna have to do so today we're gonna talk about problem definitions and things that can go wrong with problem definitions, and so it'll have you identify some potential problems with problem definitions and then fixing them. And then we're going to talk about some basic data stuff, assembling evidence. We're going to talk about criteria, so there'll be questions on that. The surveys are posted under announcements on Sakai. The problem sets will be posted under assignments on Sakai. So you'll go in there into the assignment tab and see problem set 1. One thing that we do ask is that you don't upload a Word document or any kind of document with your answers. We want your answers in that text box provided by Sakai. You can do them in a Word document or a Google Doc and copy and paste it. That's totally fine. We don't need to see the questions again or anything like that, but it's a much more efficient process for grading if all the answers are just in those text boxes. Yeah. And I do release, just so you know, I do release the answer templates after, everyone's turned them in. So. Okay. Well, so today, as I said, we're going to be talking about problem definitions. This is something that I think a lot of people think is very, very straightforward and relatively simple, and it's not. And I think hopefully by the end of today you'll realize why it's not, and what it is that sort of you need to do for your paper. Sorry, I'm just trying to get all my windows lined up. One of these days I'm going to figure out why it won't let me do a slideshow and still see everybody. But that's okay. All right. If you have questions, feel free to raise your hands, comments, anything like that. I've got TK and Faya and Lauren to shout them out for me. So, problem definitions. It is, in its essence, sort of simple in terms of where you start. And that's just with some kind of, it can be subjective, feeling, belief, that there is some problem out there, some need out there that public policy might be able to address. And you're going to turn this subjective notion, something maybe that you read in the news or that you talked about with your friends or your family, or just something you feel like you heard somewhere sometime, right? You're going to turn it into an objective, descriptive definition using data. I think it's really important at the start of the process not to worry about whether or not government intervention, right, is appropriate. We're going to talk about that later on. Right now, just identify some problem that's interesting to you, and go from there. One of the big things is when you're thinking about this in your head, even, or just writing it down on paper. From the very beginning, it's good to get into the habit of avoiding any kind of language that might incite some sort of emotional response. Okay, and that's what Bardak really means when he says issue rhetoric. It's sort of a fancy word for anything that is going to bring emotions into play from the get-go. Yeah. So, it can be anything from, not using the words illegal alien to not using words like arbitrarily or unfairly. Generally speaking, when you're thinking about this, there's really no need for adverbs. So maybe you can just keep that in the back of your mind. That when you're coming up with a basic definition, it should just be very straightforward, and something that your grandma could understand. Yeah. So here is the general approach that I tell people works for me, and seems to be a very, very common approach in policy analysis and stuff everywhere. Obviously, you're starting with some kind of basic need. Again, this can be subjective. It can be something from your own life. I actually recommend this in terms of your papers. Something from your own experiences. So it could be something that happened to you, or some situation that you faced, or someone in your family faced, or your friends, or your community, or what have you. But anytime you can kind of personalize it, it tends to give you the incentive to do a much better job. Yeah. So you identify this need. As Bardak points out, it's useful to think about deficit and excess, because that's a good way of just not getting too specific. So, the statement, there's too much congestion in Chapel Hill, I think that's something we can basically all agree on, even under COVID. Although I guess if you don't have a car, it's not that big of a deal. I do want to point out, actually, and I will post something that you can check this stuff out. But there is an issue that the Chapel Hill Town Council is facing right now that I think is interesting, where they are considering essentially buying West Franklin Street, of taking over control, and I'm talking about the street itself, not the shops or anything like that, but taking control over that portion of Franklin Street, so that they can keep it as just a 2-lane thing, with those other 2 lanes being used for outside dining, pedestrians, and that kind of thing. It's currently scheduled to be resurfaced by the North Carolina Department of Transportation, I believe, in early summer. And when they do that, they're going to do all 4 lanes. And the town essentially is trying to preempt them by taking over control of that road. Something interesting, I think, that you can follow along, and local stuff tends to grab people a little bit more. But having Franklin only be 2 lanes doesn't do a whole lot of good for the congestion. It's also terrible if you're a biker, because there used to be a lot more space to bike. Anyway, so you can think about this, yeah. And then you want to go and you want to do some research. You want to gather some initial data, okay? Am I right that this problem exists? How big is it? Who is it affecting? And you're lucky that these days it's very easy to find data. You can start with news sources, but just know that should not be the final source of data for you, because they're not collecting it themselves. They should be linking to the original source, so you can just click through there. But you want the source of your data to be a more kind of academic source, whether it's an actual academic, a think tank, government agency, an international agency or nonprofit, those types of things. And just to give you a tip, right? You can literally take your problem. Let's say there's too much childhood obesity in North Carolina. Well, you can put childhood obesity, North Carolina, and then just add the word data to a Google search, and you'll be amazed at what you can find. Another trick is to really dive into think tanks. And the easiest way to do that is there is a very little known specific Google search bar for think tanks. It's kind of like Google Scholar, but it's for think tanks. And the way you get there is you just go to google.com, and in the main search bar, you have to type the words Google think tanks. And the first hit will give you a very, very bare bones search engine page. Very good place to find data, to find reports. It's going to be a really good way to find alternatives and people evaluating alternatives. But in policy research, we do use a lot of think tank sources. So you're gathering all this data, you're figuring out how big the problem is, who it affects, and then you want to sort of be thinking about the causes, right? What are some of the causal mechanisms at play here? And you want to start identifying sources to back that up. Yeah. You don't need to go full on into all the different causes and that kind of stuff, but identifying sort of primary causes can be good. And again, you're going to be using existing research. You're going to be using think tank reports, government agencies, academic reports, etc., to do that. One of the major problems that people face when they are crafting their own problem definition is that they limit themselves from the start. And they do this by putting the solution to the problem within the problem definition itself. So just give you an example, right? Here's a problem that exists in the United States. There are too many young black men in prison. Okay? Using that sort of excess language, it's fairly generic. There's lots of data to show exactly how many there are, what proportion of the population, what the impacts are on those men, on their families, on their communities, etc. Okay, that is a perfectly fine single sentence description of your problem definition. What you don't want to do is say, because of federal mandatory minimums, there are too many young black men in prison. Because then the solution is right there. Let's eliminate mandatory minimums. And you remember, with the policy analysis, you're looking at several different alternative ways to make a problem better, not just one. So that is one cause, but there's lots of different causes. There's lots of different reasons why there are so many people in prison. And so, you're going to use those different causal mechanisms to help you craft different policy alternatives. So you want to avoid that in your initial statement of the problem. And I say the goal here is to have a single sentence that summarizes your problem. That's like an intermediary goal. It's not the end goal, because you're going to write like 2 to 4 pages defining your problem, right? You can't have all the data and stuff that you need in a single sentence, but it's a useful clarifying device to have a single sentence like the one I just gave. There are too many young black men in prison. Okay? It helps you sort of focus. Yeah. As you're sort of going down, you're going to find these sort of natural stopping points. Yeah, where you have enough, you say, okay, yeah, this is a big problem. It's affecting lots of people. I found sort of the causes. You then have to ask yourself, is this too broad? And most of the time, the answer is going to be yes. So what you do is you just stop. You choose, you identify a way to narrow it down, and you repeat this process. And there's lots of ways to narrow it down. You can do it geographically. You can look at the whole U.S. You can look at a state. You can look at a city. You can look at a county. You can look at a region, right? There's lots of ways to break it down geographically. And for certain policy topics like education, you're sort of going to have to do it at the state or local level because there's not a whole lot of federal education policy. Yeah. You can do it by demographic groups, right? So instead of there are too many people in prison, there are too many young black men in prison. But you want to narrow it to a point where it becomes manageable, where the number of causal factors isn't so crazy. Yeah. And, this is something that you're going to work on with your grader. A lot of people will submit an initial problem definition that's either too broad or too narrow. And that's one of the things that when you meet with your grader, and even as you're writing it, go to their office hours and ask them, should I make this more narrow? How could I narrow it down? Um, you're extremely fortunate that TK and Faya have read a whole lot of Policy 210 papers, and they have a very good idea as to sort of the appropriate breadth of your topics. Okay. Any questions? All right. An important step in the problem definition process is identifying exactly who is being affected by the problem itself and by any policy solutions that you might be proposing. Right? So we call these people stakeholders. They have a stake in the matter, right? They have an interest in the matter. And so I give you here just 3 questions that you can use to help you identify stakeholders and help you sort of break this down in ways that's going to be useful. The first one is very simple, right? Who's affected by it? How are the effects, as it currently stands, right? Who's suffering from the current situation? Who's benefiting from the current situation? Yeah. Laying all of that out. It's important to understand this because it gets to how big of a problem it is, how many people it's affecting, are those people politically powerful in any meaningful way, those types of things. And then you need to ask yourself, okay, well, if we do some kind of policy change to address this problem, is it going to create new problems? Are there sort of unintended consequences that might come up when we do this? In the other section here, I use the example of hog waste lagoons. Anybody from an area where there are such things? Well, if you're not, and you're not familiar with the process, that these large sort of industrial farming operations, almost all of the pig waste goes into essentially lakes of pig waste. They call them lagoons. And these things are susceptible to flooding and other potential problems. They also just stink. There's potential threats that it leaks into drinking water and all kinds of things like that. I think it's a useful example because it's easy to identify people that are directly negatively affected by hog waste lagoons because it's generally the people who live right there. Like me in Chapel Hill, it doesn't affect me. But let's say we do something to change the system of how we deal with hog waste. Well, that's potentially going to have impact on people who are employed by these companies. Yeah, so they have a stake in this too. And you need to include them in your analysis. You also need to think about how will people respond to a policy change. Okay, this is especially true for people who are going to be negatively affected in some way, because we know that human beings, if they're going to be hurt by something, they're going to try to avoid it. Right? And you see this all the time in policy where there's like great intentions and they try to do something good, But people are very clever and they can figure the way around things. Um, so a classic example here has to do with automobile uh, emissions in big cities. Um, and so anybody been to like Mexico City, Manila, any of those places, Beijing? Yeah, it's pretty nasty when it comes to air quality. My wife lived in Manila for about 6 months after college, and the data point that she heard was sitting in traffic in Manila for an hour has the same effect on your lungs as smoking 2 packs of cigarettes. So, yeah. Um, anyway, Mexico City tried to address this problem, by trying to reduce the number of cars on the road. And what they said was, if your license plate ends in an even number, you can drive on these days, and if it ends in an odd number, you can drive on these days. They're like genius. We're cutting it in half right away. Well, what did people do? Anybody want to take a guess? Ibrahim?
Perhaps they got 2 different license plates and then just switched it around on the day that corresponded to the day that they could drive.
Yeah, I mean, Mexico City thought about that a little bit, in that they couldn't go to like the equivalent of the DMV and just get another plate, but
Like
they
they
have
could switch
different.
it around with somebody.
Yeah, they switch around with friends and family members and things like that. So whoever needs to drive on any given day, right? They're just passing around license
Switch
plates.
around.
Uh, Anybody think of anything else? So in the other section, there's a woman actually from Bogota, Colombia, and she said they tried to do the same thing there, and what people did was they just bought a second car. Um, and you saw this in other places too. And here's the thing: they're buying a car just to be able to drive it on those days. So they're not buying like new efficient vehicles. They're buying like old clunkers who end up polluting more. So it actually has the exact opposite effect as the intended one of the policy. So you have to be aware of these types of things. There is this law of unintended consequences, right? The general idea being there are always going to be some kind of unintended consequences, and we have to have some built-in mechanism to deal with them. This perverse incentives, that Mexico City example, is sort of the same thing, actually cause additional harm. The classic example of what's known as a moral hazard is, say, making people buy insurance, because it's just a fact that people who are insured are more likely to engage in risky behavior. So you might get, again, sort of the opposite harm. And then you always have to keep politics in the back of your mind, right? What are the political consequences of this? Are people going to be incentivized to get together and advocate for this policy change or to oppose this policy change? I'm generally more of a politics person in general, like, right, as opposed to just a pure analysis person. So, there's this great article called "Why Politics is More Fundamental Than Economics," and I believe that's totally true when it comes to what kinds of policies actually get enacted. Um, at the same time, this class is sort of rooted in my belief that there is a important role for actual just policy analysis, objective policy analysis. Okay, but you can't do that well without a recognition of political barriers and political influences. Because if you just keep recommending the most effective policy option, that isn't at all politically feasible, you're not a very good analyst. You know, and people aren't really going to listen to your recommendations. Okay. Any questions on that? All right. If you haven't had a chance to read the Rochefort and Cobb article, that's essentially what this slide is getting at. There's a table in there. It's table 10 that I really recommend that y'all look at and use for studying purposes and that kind of thing. But they do a very nice job of going into more detail than what I'm going to do right now about some of these issues with problem definitions. Okay. The first two are very straightforward. Too general, too specific. They're very straightforward, but again, it's a fine line in between those two things. And one that, you know, you're just going to have to kind of mess with. Then you get into certain characteristics of the problem itself that are going to pose difficulties, or at least you need to think about these things. Yeah. How severe it is. Yeah. Is this something that is just hugely catastrophic? Because if it is, even if it only affects a relatively few number of people, it's more likely to get on the agenda and have something done about it. So think about airplane crashes. Yeah. We have this whole environment of the TSA and everything built up around these very, very small chances that somebody is going to blow up an airplane. If it's not severe, right? If it's the opposite, then people may not take it seriously. Or they might say, look, it's just not a big enough deal that the government should be doing something about it. Right? This is exactly what Florida is saying right now with COVID. That, look, we don't think the Omicron variant is severe enough to justify further government intervention and sort of taking away of some kind of individual liberties. That's exactly the kind of thing that I want you to be thinking about. And that's incidents. That's what that, like, how often is it going to happen? You hear incidents argued both ways with COVID and Omicron, right? You've got people who are like, well, look, everybody's going to get it eventually, so I might as well just do it. You know, and then it's like, well, yes, but if everybody gets it, then a lot more people are going to get seriously ill and potentially die. Novelty is an interesting one when things are new, right? We may not have enough data to really fully understand the problem, and especially to understand the causal mechanisms. So that can be problematic. There also may not be enough research on solutions, on policy alternatives that people have tried, for us to be able to really know what works, what doesn't work, and that kind of thing. So often you'll see some new big problem. It'll get lots of attention. Somebody might try to do something about it, but then usually it just kind of fades away into the background and goes away. But so that's something to think about. Proximity is a big one. And proximity here means how close people are to the problem itself. This could be you, this could be policymakers, this could be advocates, you know, whatever. But if the problem is not something you are seeing in your own life, it's hard to get super fired up about it. And, you know, it's hard to truly understand that there is a problem. You know, so I think, you know, you could say, you know, proximity and increasing proximity played a huge role in changing cultural views of same-sex marriage. That when you had people like Dick Cheney suddenly be like, oh, this actually affects my daughter. Then suddenly it becomes more proximate to him. It's more meaningful to him. And that changes things. You also have kind of the reverse of this. Anybody know what NIMBY stands for? NYMBY?
Not in my backyard.
Not in my backyard. Okay, so NIMBY politics and policy is a huge thing, especially at the local level. So anytime, for example, a town wants to put in a new town dump, nobody wants it near their house. So it's the people who aren't very politically powerful or who don't mobilize who end up getting the dump near their house. So I asked this question in the other section too. I'm just curious. Anybody visit or from DC? Leah, Sneha, are you from DC? Are you visited?
I've visited quite a few times.
I'm
Okay.
from DC.
Yeah. Well, tell me this. As being a native of DC, can you take the metro to Georgetown?
Not easily.
No. Why not?
The stops are like quite far away, even though that's probably one of the biggest shopping centers down there. So it's not
Yeah.
super accessible.
Yeah, like there is no metro stop in Georgetown, even though Georgetown is clearly a place where a lot of people would like to go. There's shopping, there's bars, there's restaurants, there's freaking Georgetown University, right? But there is no stop there because the people who live in Georgetown didn't want all the poor black people from Southeast having easy access to Georgetown. And they didn't want other people in general. They liked being a little bit isolated from that potentiality. That's NIMBY. Yeah. And then crisis. Okay, crisis is a word that you see in policy and politics too often, in my opinion, because it gets to the point where you use it so much that it doesn't mean anything anymore. But generally speaking, when there is some imminent crisis situation, people are more likely to accept policies and solutions that they otherwise wouldn't. And so thinking about it in those terms can be helpful. All right. I've been going for a long time now. Let's take a little break. Anybody have a random fact? Well, I'll tell you the same thing I told the other class, and I apologize for non-sports fans. Any big Dallas Cowboy fans in the class?
I'm a big Dallas Cowboys hater.
Okay, well, this is for you, Zachary. Uh, if you don't like the Dallas Cowboys, you need to look up and watch the intro to First Take with Stephen A. Smith yesterday, the day after, because it is absolutely hysterical. And yeah, I grew up a Washington fan, so I appreciate it when the Cowboys lose.
Unfortunately, it is one less fan base that the Packers are going to be able to make cry this season, which is sad. But
So
there'll
you're a
be-
Packers.
Yes, sir. Yeah,
You're
go
a cheesehead.
Pack. Trying to be.
Mm. All right. Well, do you feel like your brain is sufficiently rusted? No. I see lots of no's. I know that mine isn't, but I don't really have any choice. All right. This I took a break before this next one because it's really important, and at the same time it's very hard to sort of wrap your hands around. Um, I think the easiest way to sum it up comes from Deborah Stone. And she writes that perception is more important than reality in politics and policy. Um, and I think it's a truth that it is our perception of the world that is our reality. And it's hard to change people's perceptions. And what happens a lot of times with problems in society is that some people have a perception that there is a huge problem, and some people have a perception that there isn't. And to each of those groups, it is their reality. And it is very difficult to convince one of them that their reality is incorrect. So, I think a recent example of this really is the Black Lives Matters movement, where you have large, segments of society really getting behind it, really understanding it. It's sort of related to proximity, right, up there, of people who actually experience the kinds of harms that Black Lives Matter is seeking to address. But then you have large swaths of the public that literally never see it. And so to them, it's not real. And, overcoming these perceptions, these misperceptions, is difficult. You see this with COVID too. Anybody who's been just outside of a major city in North Carolina has probably seen different perceptions of COVID in action. I was recently in the far east of the state where nobody wore a mask, like in Lowe's. Jay?
So this is a random fact kind of related to perception.
Okay.
So there are 100,000 Mexican Americans that have incomes over $90,000, and that's like considered wealthy. And that means that there are more wealthy Mexican Americans than there are wealthy Mexicans that have that same income.
Okay. It's intriguing. Oh. So when you're coming up with your problem definitions, right? It's important to address these competing perceptions. And this is why we avoid the issue rhetoric. Okay, like at the bottom of this list, you see problem definition as political expression. It's sort of a similar thing. You don't want to use language that's going to immediately turn people off from what you're saying. For people who disagree with what you're saying or who have a different perception, using any of that kind of language gives them leverage to discredit what you're saying. It's just political, right? The next one on the list, measurement, is one that is, we talked a little bit about it before, but in social sciences and policy research in particular, getting good measurements can be difficult. People may disagree on the process for measuring something, like what is an appropriate measure. They may use the same process and come to a different observation, like get a different observation. So how things are measured becomes super important. And you know, if you look, for example, at how poverty is measured in the United States, the official poverty rate is measured under an assumption that we spend 1/3 of our income on food. And what they do is they take how much it costs to buy enough food to live decently. They multiply that by 3. That's the poverty line. Okay, so there's all kinds of problems with that measurement. One, it was constructed in the 1960s, and nobody spends 1/3 of their income on food anymore. But that's the one that we use. And using that measurement, people can make the argument that all of the social programs we put in place in the 60s and 70s have had almost no impact on the poverty rate. But that's because those programs and the benefits that they provide are not included in that calculation. So simply by changing the measurement, we have a completely different situation. Right? If we use some percentage of median income or another way of measuring poverty, then in fact poverty has gone down. Yeah. Affected population here really is getting at political feasibility. And, you know, it will be interesting to see how President Biden's executive order on cost benefit analysis that requires looking at distributional effects, how that impacts problem definitions and this affected population sort of notion. But historically, you know, this has meant that if the people who are being negatively affected have some kind of political sway, it's much less likely to happen. If they have no political sway, then it's not going to happen. The ends means thing, you know, they talk a little bit about this in the article. What I want you to think about here is that as a policy analyst, if you go in and you try to convince somebody that there is some kind of problem and you don't have a solution at hand, they're not going to listen to you. Yeah, having a problem alone is insufficient. Okay. Causation is one of the most complicated problems that you're going to face. And it sort of rears up in lots of different ways. It could be that there are just a ton of different causal mechanisms at play here, which makes any one of them not super huge, and therefore if it's addressed, there's not going to be a big impact. It could also just be really messy identifying sort of the primary causal factors. You also get into things like, was it an intentional act that's causing this, or was it accidental? You know, if it's accidental, a lot of people are like, whatever, you know, too bad. Sucks to be you. Whatever. Yeah. If it's intentional, that changes things. And we're going to talk a lot about causation, you know, later on in the semester. But highly recommend reading that section in the Rochefort and Cobb thing, because they do a much better job than my adult brain right now. Zachary?
Yeah, I just had a question. Whenever we're talking about effects that have to do with this problem definition and these accidental effects, a lot of times those accidental effects tend to what's the word I'm looking for? I guess tend to hurt people that are of minorities in racial and socioeconomic lines. And I'm guessing, like, from a public policy standpoint, how do we address that while trying to remain objective in defining these problems and defining possible solutions in that way.
I'm just trying to see if I understood the question right. Uh, a lot, what you're saying is a lot of the sort of unintended or sort of accidental consequences of things are affecting groups of people without any kind of real political power. Is that what you're saying?
Essentially, yeah. I was probably
Yeah.
rambling too much, but yeah,
Oh
that
no,
was
it's
what I
fine.
was saying.
Yeah, it's just how do you deal with that? You just acknowledge it. Um, I think, and again, this is where Biden's executive order is interesting to see what kind of impact it has. Now, it only applies to cost benefit analyses at the federal level, but whether it introduces some element that becomes more commonly used in policy analyses across the country, we sort of waits to be seen. But, historically, it is politically marginalized communities that get screwed by public policy. And if somebody had figured out a way to totally stop that, I figured that they would have done so by now. I think you can find individual circumstances where things happen. I've talked a lot in the past about citing dumps and things like that, and factories and other things. It's almost always in the backyard of low-income minority populations. It certainly is in Chapel Hill. And what happened in Chapel Hill, just a little history for you, in the 60s when they were trying to find a place to put the dump, they identified a spot. It's off Eubanks Road. It's right next to one of two historically black communities in Chapel Hill. They were actually able to organize to a certain extent with the help of various community members, people from UNC and that kind of stuff. And they essentially bargained. They said, okay, you can put the dump in there, but this is what we want in return. And the main thing that they wanted was access to sewer and water services, like town sewer and water services. So they said, okay. But that was in the late 1960s. And that community got access to sewer and water about 2 years ago. So.
If I can jump back in, I guess that also makes me think about what the policy that you were bringing up earlier in regards to Franklin Street and the road and attempting to retake those two lanes on the side. And I think about how having that extra space for pedestrians to walk, at least in my mind, and what I've noticed is that it makes it generally safer, and more people are more willing to walk in that area. And so it makes me think about, if we do take those two lanes back to allow for cars, are we taking away from the ability for communities within UNC or within Chapel Hill to be able to access that space in different areas like that? And I know that's probably not directly correlated to what we're talking about right now, so I'm sorry.
I think that's the big question, right? And that's why the town council is looking at taking over control of that, because that's their thought as well. So, look, it's a fascinating issue to follow. That's why I brought it up, and it's something that will affect you all, assuming you get on campus and go to Franklin Street. So, okay. All right, the last one on here that I'll talk about is the sort of nature of the solution. Oftentimes, when there is some kind of proposed solution that seems extreme, it will lead people to kind of deny the existence of the problem. And again, not to, well, no, I'm just going to do it anyway. this has been the argument with COVID, right? The solution is worse than the problem. It's wait, what did I say? The cure is worse than the problem. Yeah. You know, a lot of people agree with that, and they think that, you know, mandating vaccines, mandating masks, all of that kind of stuff, you know, essentially isn't worth it. And what the way that they go about then arguing it is that Omicron really isn't that big of a problem. Yeah. Ibrahim?
I was going to say, Professor, like that topic that you just brought up with like about government intervention and how the argument that because Omicron is not enough of a threat that you can that one can just ignore it and because it's not worth seeing it. Like I feel like, but I feel like that type of argument, the people that make that argument don't realize the fact that it's not necessarily about Omicron directly, but it's about the fact that if you never acknowledge it, right, you may get a new strain. Like for instance, there's a new strain out from France, the HAI, something like that, and it's in France and it's a new strain, and it actually came out I think a week and a half ago, and it was first seen in the hospital. I don't know if it's made it to the US yet, but like the whole idea, you know, I don't find like that whole like argument of Omicron is just not enough, because Omicron
that's sort of my point, right? Is that, you know, you're talking about different perceptions, and different perceptions of reality, and it's hard to change that. And I mean, you're right in terms of the ability for the virus to spread, and especially for the ability for the virus to stay in a single host for a significant amount of time, increases the chances of variation. Right. Yeah, but I mean, people who don't think they're going to get it, yeah, or, you know, don't think it's going to be that bad, doesn't really matter to them.
Makes sense.
So, yeah. All right. So I thought it might be useful, just with the last sort of 10 minutes or so we have here, to go through an example. And this comes out of my sort of interests in my dissertation to a certain extent. I used to be a legal aid attorney, and one of my big areas of interest is access to justice, access to the legal system. But, you know, I kind of wanted to start from the beginning a little bit, and how I envision this happening with people. So, you know, you can just imagine you're just sitting there thinking about it, and you kind of notice with your friends, with your families, with yourself, whoever, that, you know, people need a lawyer sometimes. And it seems like most people need a lawyer at some point in their lives. And more often than actually we would like to admit. And there's a big problem there, in that lawyers are really expensive. And so what happens if I get into a situation where I need a lawyer, but I can't afford to pay for one? So that's sort of like a subjective thought of what may be a problem. But I'm thinking about it, and I'm like, man, that's super broad, right? So I know that there's two sides to the legal system. There's a civil side, there's a criminal side. So I'm just going to immediately narrow this down and say, I care more about the civil side. It could just be personal interest. It could be based on research, you know, or what have you. Say, okay, I'm just going to focus on the civil side. So then I'm like, okay, well, is this actually a problem? And I go out and I do some research and see, okay, how often does this occur? how often are people unable to find an attorney when they need one based on their inability to pay? And I find a bunch of studies that all seem to point to a similar number. And that number is 80%. 80% of people who have a legal need don't have that need met because of the cost of lawyers. This is where the power of numbers becomes apparent. 80% is huge. That's 4 out of 5. Yeah? And you can't argue that. There's no way to spin 80% to make it not seem huge. Yeah? Except for this. Right? Like, what if somebody says, well, so what if you don't have an attorney? You can represent yourself. So then you have to start thinking, okay, well, maybe it's not just not having an attorney, not having my legal needs met. It's the impact. It's the effects of that. And so you have to go and you have to do more research and be like, okay, well, look, is there a significant difference in outcomes between people who are represented by an attorney and people who aren't? And you find, unsurprisingly, that yes, there is a big difference. So then you start thinking about, okay, well, what happens to me if I don't have access to an attorney? What are the effects? I might lose my house. I might lose some form of income, right? It could be from a job. It could be unemployment insurance. It could be Social Security, whatever. It could be that I find myself in a situation of domestic violence and I'm unsafe, right? So that becomes the actual problem. Okay, the problem is the effects of not having access to a lawyer. That's still pretty broad, so I'm going to want to narrow that down further. And as I said earlier, there's lots of different ways that you could do it. I could pick out other, like, I could do like substantive areas. Like, I'm going to focus on housing. I'm going to focus on domestic violence. I'm going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on geographic area, or particular demographics, whatever. The key is that you narrow it in such a way that it remains interesting to you and that you have enough data and enough alternatives to really do a good job with the analysis. Yeah. Once you do that, you need to think about the stakeholders. And just because of time, I'm not really going to go through this, but I find it really helpful in these situations to actually make a table, right? And these are the questions, that I had talked about earlier of how to identify stakeholders. But you can just make a table to have all of your sort of thoughts in one place. Now, you don't want to put a table in your paper. Okay? It's really an organizing device to let you know where there might be some issues, where you might need to find more information, that kind of thing. No. So, I'll let y'all do this on your own just because I've apparently rambled too long. I think it's useful to go back to that list of issues earlier and relate it back to that problem definition I just talked about. And I'm going to do it for one of them. Okay, and that's, which one do I want to do? I'm going to do causation. And there's a reason why here, because if you were paying attention up here, I actually took care of narrowing it for causation in the problem definition. I said because of cost. There are other reasons why somebody might not have access to an attorney. Yeah. There's also the whole causal question of why they need an attorney in the first place. Did they do something bad, or is somebody trying to do something bad to them? Yeah. But I think it's important to understand that cost isn't the only factor. And when you start thinking about affected populations, and you start thinking about alternatives and solutions and that kind of thing, it's not just providing free attorneys. That's something that you could do. I would throw out there that one of the biggest reasons why some people don't have access to an attorney is not money, it's that they don't know any attorneys. If any of you have attorneys in your family, or if any of you have doctors or nurses or something in your family, you understand how important that connection is. And the bottom line is a lot of low-income people are living in communities where people don't go become attorneys or doctors or nurses or whatever. Just having that, like, I could do a whole nother problem definition right there. Right? A whole different set of alternatives of how to sort of increase access to attorneys via networks as opposed to, other things. All right. A couple of minutes left. Any questions? Your noise.
Hi Jeff, I have a question.
Yes.
So for the problem, do we have to deal with American problem, or we can do like policy problem from other country?
Yeah, you can do one from another country. The only real limiting factor there is that you are familiar enough with that country to understand the correct political institution.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, Thursday, I'll see you back on Zoom. We're talking about criteria, I believe. And the readings for that are on the Sakai site. There isn't a separate folder for it. I'll try to remember to create one. But the readings are there. And everybody have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you.
Hi, I have one question before you
Okay,
go.
hold on
Sorry.
for 1 second. Let me stop the recording.